All right, so today is the first CT. It's going to be on framing and characterization. But first, just welcome back to everybody who is coming back, who's already a member of the union, and also for people who this is their first CT. Just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm Karis. I'm obviously the CT organizer. I'm a third year. I have quite a bit of competitive debating experience at university level. I've done quite a few international competitions. I've also been to prep season twice over the summer, which has been pretty intense, but I have quite a good amount of knowledge of what like big competitions are like. Then talking about some expectations and goals for this year. So obviously CT is going to be every week at 6 p.m. Workshops are going to focus on like direct application of information to motion. So what this means is that while I do want to do some matter heavy workshops, most of these will be grounded very much within the realm of BP, and you'll only be learning things that'll be relevant to motions that get said a lot, mostly looking to develop more stock analysis that'll be useful. And I'm also hoping to have a lot of engagement during these workshops. So I would encourage experienced members to chime in with comments or additions where they think they're relevant, but also everybody, please feel free to ask questions. I'll pause every now and again. And if there's any questions or anything in the chat, feel free to ask anything. Practice debates will be happening after the workshop as usual. I'm going to be continuing the practice that started last year, coming up with individual feedback for everybody after debates. So you don't need to approach me for that. I will just literally just send it to you. It seems like Brynna's re-entered. That's fine. Also, there'll be a panel that you can also get feedback from. And then also, hopefully, we will have in-person sessions soon. This is largely dependent on use that I'm told. Also, Bryn, who I'm sure is going to sort this out for us as our secretary, will book us a lot of rooms. I'm really glad that he rejoined the call while I was on this slide. Anyway, most of the content in this workshop has been taken from these two very, very good workshops. The first one is I think it's a famous one because a lot of people have recommended it to me. It's Adam Hawksbee for like Manchester Debate Union, and it's how to win debates without really making arguments. I watched this at during my very first prep season before Euros, and I think it improved how I debated like directly after watching it. It's really good. I would definitely recommend everybody to watch that. The other one is Framing Characterization by Tin. This one is a little bit more recent. The other one's from like 2015. It's still like pretty relevant today, but I would say the Tin one is more about meta debating. That's what the emphasis is put on now. And because I think that the meta of debating has developed quite a bit since 2015, the second one is probably a little bit more relevant, but the first one is really good. So definitely watch it. Okay, I'm going to start this off with probably the most obvious thing. What is framing? On a basic level, it's non-normative or value neutral analysis in a debate. So it's not prescriptive analysis. It's not the same as this is an argument for why you should propose this motion. It's something that's just descriptive about the world the debate takes place in. So then within debates, it is context for arguments. So specifically the kind of framing you'll want to provide will be context that is not already accepted by all sides, or context that is new to the debate or makes new arguments possible. So on a motion about the environment, you don't need to frame that the climate crisis exists, but if you're debating something about like for instance, the South supports global regulation of the price of oil. If you want to start off by framing OPEC currently being in trouble a little bit because of American fracking pushing down cost of production, that is new context that could improve the importance of certain arguments or introduce new arguments to a debate. The second thing is context that gives you the upper hand. So this is also pretty obvious. Framing is about deciding what the debate should be about. So good framing will make your arguments seem more important and will make the arguments of your opponent seem less important. So where argumentation is the battle of debate, framing is choosing your battlefield selectively in a way that is preferential to you. What then is characterization? So some people use these two terms to mean the same thing. I think they're probably kind of distinct. In the general usage, characterization is more of a tool that you use to prove your framing is true. So characterization is, again, about like non-normative or non-descriptions of a debate, or like contextualizing a debate. But I think characterization is slightly different from framing in that like framing is usually about like the meta debate. So like stuff like what's my burden or something, whereas characterization might be like, okay, what are Putin's like goals and aims? Like what does he want or something like that. So you'll be familiar with characterization from any motion that requires you to analyze stakeholders. So for an example of characterization could be like on this house is Israel would form a strategic military alliance with the Kurds in Syria. You might want to characterize what Israel's primary objectives are. Probably in this context, it'll be something like national security. But specifically, if your argument is about how this improves national security for Israel, you'll want to characterize that Israel's primary objective is national security and that this is more important than all other goals. And the goal of this is to frame the debate ought to be about what team best accomplishes getting better national security. So that's also like laying out burdens. Why is framing important? So debaters aren't actually that creative most of the time, but also importantly, most motions like CAs have select arguments they kind of want people to run. So what this means is that usually at the best room in a competition, the arguments that are being made aren't all that different or distinct from the ones that are being made in like crappy rooms. Like obviously they'll be better analyzed and stuff like that, but like they're usually fundamentally going to be a similar argument. So stock analysis in debates that has a lot of well-developed rebuilding that's already known, like widely known, it probably is, it's common enough. So what this means is a lot of arguments, people already have intuitive responses to them, but also people will have developed intuitive rebuilding to them. What that means is framing is an important extra tool that you can use to win without having to disprove as many claims, but you can make arguments that have already been made irrelevant. Okay, how then do you use framing effectively? So there's going to be kind of like 4 points in this next section, and I'm just going to talk about like what the kind of context that you would use framing. But before I move on, does anybody have any questions or comments? I can't see the chat, so I don't know. If nobody says anything, I'm just going to move on. Okay, so the first thing is clarifying, shirking, and pushing burdens. So just very briefly, burdens in a debate are what your side has to prove if they want to win. So on this house believes it is legitimate for environmental activists to use violence to achieve their goals. It is probably going to be the burden of government to prove that violence is an effective tactic for activism. Framing can also be used to lower the barrier on what you prove, what you need to prove to win, or make it a higher barrier for your opponent to win. So for example, if I had the motion, this house regrets the rise of Xi Jinping, favorable framing on op would be to make it very explicit that the government's burden is not just to prove that Xi Jinping's leadership is like has done harm, but also to prove that likely alternatives would have been better. Why is this favorable to them? Number one, it's harder because they're going to have to analyze like the probability of other actors and like what they're likely to do. Secondly, they're just going to have to spend more time doing this, so it takes more work. And thirdly, it makes their benefits speculative if they don't do it. So if they just say these are all the reasons why Xi Jinping is like a bad person, then we're unsure why there would be any difference if they haven't analyzed the comparative of like whatever the replacement for Xi Jinping would be. So if top half only talked about these things or like the merits or the problems with Xi Jinping, then this is literally just going to win you the debate from bottom half. If you make it clear that this isn't comparative unless you talk about like what the alternative would be. So this is an example of a way you could introduce new framing and bottom half to like make an extension and basically make top half irrelevant or wash them out. The second thing you can use framing to do is limit the scope of the debate to areas in which you're likely to win that debate. So this is a way of making other arguments irrelevant, which is kind of like overpowered if you're able to do it successfully. So for example, on this house would legally enforce Ulysses contracts. Just to be very clear, Ulysses contracts are contracts that are like self-binding and self-imposed. So I could say like, I want to stop smoking. So every time I smoke, I'm going to donate 10 pounds to charity, something like that. In this motion, in an ideal world, op only talks about instances in which the goals of the contract, which is like to modify your own behaviors, is never fulfilled and where the consequences of its enforcement are devastating or just have really bad impacts. That's where they want to limit the scope of the debate to, because that is where they are always winning. So good framing for op to do this would be saying, this is really drastic. The fact that it's legally enforceable weeds out a lot of well-adjusted individuals who can probably do this in a way that's self-imposed, reliably outside the legal system. It's likely going to be a last resort when all other options are exhausted. So probably in situations where someone's trying to stop like long-term substance abuse or something like that. And these kinds of problems are very resistant from change and do not have linear recovery. So like you're likely to relapse on your road to recovery, and you're likely to incur the punishment. If op can explain that the only people who are going to accept these legally enforced Ulysses contracts are these people who will always fail, then op always win, because they've successfully narrowed the debate to people who always have terrible outcomes from this particular like type of contract. Okay, so I think the third thing then is using framing or characterization as like a method of weighing. So thinking of things like the quantity of people impacted by a particular argument, so winning on scale, framing around vulnerability of a particular group. This is something that's also pretty intuitive, or framing around the depth of impact that this has on one particular group. So a couple of motions that are probably like relevant to this: relationship motions are really susceptible to this kind of framing. If you frame that bad relationships or like unhappy marriages or something are always the most deeply affected by motions that seek to like change a norm in relationships or something, you can make other general arguments about relationships seem uncomparative if you say if they are limited in the scope of their impacts. And then also developing world extensions and econ rounds operate off pretty much the same idea, because economic development that lifts a lot of people out of abject poverty is probably always going to just outweigh anything that seeks to improve economic conditions somewhere where people have pretty uniform prosperity. The fourth is establishing urgency. So urgency here doesn't like mean like limited in terms of time. I kind of take urgency here to mean like a specific problem can remove the possibility of other good outcomes to come to fruition. So for example, in the debate, this House would remove all patents on green technology. Op can point out that the accessibility of patents is irrelevant if patents don't exist. So for instance, if you frame the debate about who gets more investment in green technology, opposition can make other arguments seem very irrelevant. Mostly because government will rely on that for their good impacts. This is similar to using like prior argumentation or saying someone's downstream from you as a weighing mechanism. So another example of this is given in the Adam Hawksbee workshop. So if under this motion, which is this House would establish LGBT schools, if op argued like gay students need this as kind of a character building exercise or a way to develop defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms to cope with the social struggles that they face, if government framed the debate to be specifically about the high rates of youth suicide in the LGBT community, something that happens while students are still in school, this argumentation obviously becomes pretty irrelevant, because being alive is upstream or predicate to developing resilience to bullying if this debate is about what happens when these people go out into wider society. Okay. Framing is a strategic tool. So what's important is that you apply it selectively. So all of these circumstances are examples of when framing is like useful, but when you shouldn't do framing is probably when other teams aren't going to contest your framing. And then obviously when the framing isn't going to be favorable to you or like change whether or not your arguments are important in the first place. So here's like some fun strategies that weighing can unlock. These are all things that like are kind of build off the things I've already said, but they're kind of like unique to weighing. The first is that you can provide a lot of clarity to really messy debates. So if you're able to like wash out your top half or sidestep a deadlock or something like that, it makes it very clear. It makes it very clear what the debate should be about. A lot of the stuff about clarifying burdens, even when you're just doing a lot of burden shirking or burden pushing, also helps clarify debates because it usually makes them about like one or two things. It also allows you to make marginal cases work by narrowing the scope. So again, if bottom half strategy is to do a lot of reframing that like narrows the scope of the debate, you can argue something that's like very marginal, so like something like nothing actually changes in this debate, but one thing that does change is optics. You can do something like that and make a very successful extension. I've done a lot of debates like that where that kind of a case has won. You can swallow large trade-offs by widening the scope. So again, if you say, okay, everything op says is true in the developed world, but we don't care about any of it because the developing world is where this has bigger impacts. So we can just swallow all of the, I don't know, for example, economic harms that happens in like the UK and the US and Europe or something. You can also just waste the time of your opponents by agreeing with their 7 minutes of analysis, but disputing its relevance. So a lot of framing can just act to serve as another tool for you to like bludgeon your opponent and try to not have to respond to their arguments. But also you're forcing your opponents to dispute your framing because they have to do this now to stay relevant. Then also you can be more responsive in POIs. Something that's interesting is I think it's very difficult if you're in a mid to high level room where people are all pretty well versed in argumentation to dismantle an argument that's being made by delivering a POI that's specifically rebuttal, because most of the time people will have like layers of argumentation that are relatively resilient. I think it is sometimes a lot easier to dismantle someone's, well, not dismantle someone's argument, but to respond to someone's argument by reframing in a POI, because framing isn't always something that will instantly go contested. Like sometimes it's an afterthought. I think this can be very useful if you're opening half and you're like trying to frame out bottom half, but like you don't have a lot of time obviously to be responsive to them. And then from bottom half, this can help you sidestep a lot of deadlocks by making the debate just about something else. And then also it's a weighing technique, as we already talked about. And then from top half, I think it can help you narrow the scope of your debate. So if you're basically calling, if you decide, okay, this debate is about like one specific thing, this is our burden, and then you do a really good job on the one thing that you've narrowed the debate to, you can call your closing half extension irrelevant before they can really deliver it, and you don't have to spend time turf burning or anything. I did this in like, I think round 9 of Euros, where we decided that we'd narrow a media debate to just be about like local media corporations, and we ended up winning that round. That can be a pretty successful strategy. That's like the whole workshop. Got through it pretty fast. Does anybody have any more questions?
I actually do have a question, if it's okay. What if you give some framing, say you're in top half or something, and then just none of the other teams accept that framing and they all try and pile on their own separate conflicting frames? Because I've seen that happen in debates where everyone characterizes something differently and it's just as chaotic.
Yeah, so that can be extremely frustrating. So it's important to emphasize that weighing has to be proven. So just like any other kind of analysis in a debate, you have to give like reasons why something is true. In that kind of a case, judges would have to pick the framing that is most like most invulnerable to responses, that has the most analysis, that has like the highest probability of being true. So I think if you're in a debate where every single person gave different characterization, it they would, and they don't respond to your initial characterization, that would be a flaw in their argumentation, especially if someone tries to reframe from bottom half without explaining why the reframing is correct. So you're right that it's chaotic, but like you won't win any brownie points by ignoring people's framing. You have to respond to it. I think also, this is something that I mentioned earlier. It's always good to at least try and outframe people, even if you know they're likely to have a response to it, because it just wastes their time. Which is something that you kind of want to do, and something that's actually pretty strategic. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, we'll move on then to the debate. I'm just going to stop. I think I need to stop recording. Not sure how to do that.